January 1946, in Bruchsal Prison, Germany, the first post-war trials of civilians accused of murdering captured Allied airmen reached their final stage. Two men, Karl Bloch and Wilhelm faced execution for taking part in the brutal killings of downed U.S. pilots during the closing months of World War II. These cases were part of a broader effort by the United States military to hold civilians accountable under international law. Civilians were not combatants, yet when Allied airmen parachuted into German territory, they were entitled to protection as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions. Instead, mobs of enraged citizens attacked these airmen, often resulting in death. Bloch and were among those identified as active participants in these crimes. Their trials set precedents for prosecuting civilians for violations of wartime law. During the final months of World War II, Allied air raids over Germany intensified. Pilots and crew members of bombers that were shot down often parachuted to safety, hoping to surrender or evade capture until they could be taken in as prisoners of war. In many areas, civilians, sometimes motivated by anger, propaganda, or fear, joined in violent attacks against these defenseless airmen. Stones, clubs, and improvised weapons were used in what became mob killings. The U.S. military documented several such cases, noting that civilians often acted in groups, with individual participants like Bloch and identified as leading attackers. Witness accounts later revealed the extreme brutality of these attacks. Survivors described pilots being beaten to death in streets with no protection afforded despite surrender or incapacitation. These acts violated established international law and the Geneva Conventions, which required humane treatment for all prisoners of war. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, U.S. military authorities initiated investigations into civilian-perpetrated killings. Karl Bloch, a German civilian, and Wilhelm were among those arrested for their involvement in mob attacks on Allied airmen. Investigators collected witness statements, often from neighbors, local officials, and soldiers who had documented the incidents. These testimonies directly linked Bloch and to the killings. Witnesses described them identifying targets, striking victims, and encouraging other civilians to join in the assaults. Photographs, maps, and military records were used to establish timelines and corroborate accounts of the crimes. Both men were taken into custody and held under U.S. military authority pending trial. Their cases were among the first civilian war crime prosecutions in post-war Germany, emphasizing the principle that ordinary citizens could be held accountable for participation in atrocities against protected combatants. The U.S. military tribunals began proceedings in late 1945. The cases of Karl Bloch and Wilhelm were brought forward on the basis of eyewitness testimony and documentary evidence. Karl Bloch was accused of taking part in the killings of downed U.S. pilots, striking victims directly, and joining in mob assaults. Witnesses testified that he did not act under duress, but participated willingly. The tribunal reviewed his actions in the context of international law, noting that civilians were legally obliged to respect the protections afforded to prisoners of war. Wilhelm faced similar charges. Witnesses described him as a leading figure in a mob that attacked defenseless airmen, identifying him as one of the individuals who escalated violence. Attempted to defend himself, claiming that he had been swept up in the crowd, but the tribunal concluded that he played an active and voluntary role in the killings. In both cases, the evidence was deemed overwhelming. The tribunal emphasized that participation in mob violence, even as a civilian, constituted a war crime. The verdicts were delivered: guilty of murder and violations of the laws of war. The sentences were death by hanging. On January 10, 1946, Wilhelm was executed at Bruchsal Prison. U.S. military personnel oversaw the execution, and the condemned man was escorted under guard to the gallows. Remained silent, facing his sentence without spectacle. Moments later, the trapdoor was released, and the sentence was carried out. 2 days later, on January 12, 1946, Karl Bloch faced the same fate in the same prison courtyard. Cameras recorded the execution for documentation purposes. Bloch was led to the gallows under guard. A U.S. military officer read the charges aloud, and the trap door was released. His life ended at the rope, marking the conclusion of one of the first civilian war crime executions conducted by Allied authorities in Germany. These executions were filmed and documented, serving as evidence of military justice in the post-war period. The cases were publicized to demonstrate that civilians could not act with impunity against prisoners of war, and that the rules of war applied universally, regardless of combatant status. While the cases focus on legal and historical aspects, witness testimonies also reveal the human impact of the crimes. Families of downed airmen were left grieving. Survivors bore psychological scars, and entire communities were forced to confront the violence that had erupted in their streets. The trials emphasized that accountability was not limited to soldiers on the battlefield. Civilians could contribute to wartime atrocities, and justice demanded that such actions be recognized and punished. The public documentation of the executions also served as a record for future generations, providing insight into the consequences of collective violence. The Bloch and Dear Man trials set a precedent for post-war justice in Germany and beyond. They demonstrated that civilians are not exempt from prosecution for war crimes. International law provides protections for prisoners of war that must be enforced. Documented trials and executions serve both as legal precedent and historical record. These cases were part of a larger pattern of accountability, which included other civilian and military trials conducted by Allied authorities in the immediate post-war period. The lessons learned informed later tribunals, including those at Nuremberg, where both military and civilian participants in atrocities were held responsible. The executions of Karl Bloch on January 12, 1946, and Wilhelm Dear Man on January 10, 1946, stand as early examples of civilian accountability in the aftermath of World War II. Both men were held responsible for participating in the violent deaths of downed U.S. airmen, emphasizing that war crimes apply to anyone who violates the laws of armed conflict.